Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. And with me today, once again, is my co-host, Youri Smouter, a host of the 1+1 program on YouTube. How are you doing today, Youri?
Oh, I'm doing great. It was a very quiet week. Didn't get. I'm a bit behind on my interview hunting, but it was a very good quiet week, and my sleep apnea got the best of me. So I did catch up on some sleep and doing a much better job of actually listening to my body when it says, "Dude, you're tired. Go sleep." So, anywho, a pretty uneventful week, but all good.
I ended up sleeping 12 hours from Friday night to Saturday morning, so I totally understand and approve. Sometimes you just need the sleep when your body says, I'm tired. Missing sleep shortens your life. Not enough sleep appears to be one of the biggest triggers for some of the worst kinds of cancer. And not enough sleep also increases your chances of worse outcomes from heart attacks and strokes.
As well as being, as well as being, quite moody. Because if you don't get enough sleep, you get you get triggered very easily. You have a very short temper, so
it throws your brain chemistry off. Yes.
so I'm glad I caught up on some good sleep and so forth. And luckily, may I have an appointment for my sleep apnea? So hopefully all of that gets sorted when that.
Every time I try to go in for something to help me sleep, they want to put me on a breathing machine, and the problem is I can't sleep in a breathing machine.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that's not going to be the outcome. But my other doctor, that I went to see for when I was sick with bronchitis was saying to me that, okay, well, the best thing to help you with like your sleep apnea is if you just try to like lose like a good amount of like weight and like keep that stable. So I am on a huge beer diet, but I do have to kick the cigarettes out of my daily.
That's a good thing to quit. Even if you can just switch from something that you don't have to burn.
Exactly.
That makes a big difference. The cigarette itself, even worse than the nicotine, is everything that goes into the cigarette itself.
Exactly. But it is to quote my hero Frank Zappa, it is one of my favorite vegetables, but it's a vegetable I should try to out of. So. Anywho.
I mean, I don't know. Have they ever really put tobacco on a salad? If you can't put it on a salad, it's not really a vegetable.
Well, we'll see. Anything goes with this current administration. So.
But speaking of this current administration, I want to talk a little bit about things that have changed and things that haven't changed. Obviously, we've had
meet the new year, same as the old year.
Yes, exactly. One of the things that's changed is the rhetoric from the White House on the border. Biden was talking about border security, and Trump is talking about mass deportations. But while the rhetoric is different, and here's just our first statistic to puzzle over. While the rhetoric is different and Trump talks about mass deportations, ICE is actually releasing people. The reason ICE is actually releasing people is because ICE jails were at 109% capacity already when Donald Trump took office. Now, why do you think that was?
Unbelievable. Well, that's definitely Joe Biden trying to up, Obama being the supporter in chief, but because he's a Democrat and because the Republicans in many ways are much more grotesque in both their rhetoric and their actions, many people weren't protesting that much when Biden was doing what Obama was doing and so forth. And he wasn't building a wall, but certainly was deporting a lot of...
the LAPD are running from anti-ICE protesters now, though. There are also anti-ICE protests in Houston, in Portland, in Detroit, all over the place.
How about actually curious question. I should have actually this off the air before we started, but in Oregon, how is the people power movement? Just whether it's Palestine solidarity or protesting some of the evil things that Trump is inflicting, or even when
They
Biden was in power.
they had to call out the black vans to disappear people in 2020.
Jesus, oh my God.
That Andy Ngo spent 2020's George Floyd riots in Portland making up bullshit about the
Outside
protest
actors
here.
or outside agitators.
What was that?
The whole like outside actors or like outside like agitators. So
Well,
like,
Antifa killing cops bullshit.
wow, this is the kind of stuff that even the best of the left never covers, and they should cover because that's quite unbelievable.
Well, but that's what the right wing does. The right wing takes something like the George Floyd protests and they say Antifa is shooting cops. And they do it usually because of something some right winger did.
Oh, come on, Chris! You're not actually saying that. One of the shooters. Well, what state was it? Was the Kyle Rittenhouse thing that Glenn Greenwald and like Matt Taibbi and like other
The Kyle Rittenhouse thing happened in Wisconsin. He drove to Wisconsin from, well, he primarily lived in Illinois with his mother. He was staying in Kenosha with his father. And he had deliberately gone to stay with his father with the intent of arming himself and protecting private property during the riots. So basically playing wannabe cop.
Unbelievable. Yeah, crazy.
And then when he actually got into trouble, he panicked and ran away. And when they chased him, he panicked and started shooting everybody.
This guy was found not guilty. Unbelievable, but there.
Well, that's the whole thing is, I mean, the gunshots that were fired at him missed because he had already wounded the guy who shot at him. It's like if the guy who shot at him really had shot first and hadn't been wounded, he probably wouldn't have been missed, and it would be a completely different trial.
Unbelievable.
And if Kyle Rittenhouse had been killed by a protester, it would have been, number one, the protester would have been convicted, I guarantee you. And number two, it would have been the trigger for Antifa is evil in all the mainstream news, all the politics. You'd see a huge FBI crackdown on Antifa and anybody claiming to be Antifa.
Unbelievable. And it's actually, and it was funny because yesterday when I was before I went to bed, I was because I have to do a show about U.S. healthcare and the need for single payer, and so I was actually looking for like Michael Moore's stuff like Sicko, and in my rabbit hole, I thought to myself, oh, let me see if Awful Truth, which was Michael Moore's very great TV program, which is sorely missed. And there was lots of really good segments. Like there's one where he completely mocks, the snobbery of like New York liberalism and like showing how like New York is actually like most like reactionary state.
What is Michael Moore's only fictional movie? Most of his movies are documentaries. What is Michael Moore's only fictional movie?
Oh, and I still haven't seen it. Canadian Bacon with
that's the one.
The late great John Candy.
The late great John Candy, which is now this is a small scene, so it's not a horrible spoiler. There is a scene where John Candy, who of course is a Canadian,
of course,
playing an American sheriff from upstate New York, is holding a Canadian Mountie played by an American stand-up comic, ironically. This is what's so funny about this scene and why I love this movie and why I think Michael Moore is a genius despite his bad politics.
Yeah.
The Canadian comedian playing the Canadian cop is holding the gun on the American who is dressed as a Canadian Mountie and pronouncing the word a boot like a Canadian. And John Candy, the Canadian, cocks his gun and says, "We have ways of making you pronounce the letter O."
That's one of those.
But what makes it work more than anything else is that when you really understand the whole stand-up meta of it, that it's a Canadian holding a gun on an American, making a nationalist American anti-Canadian joke.
No, that's hilarious. And actually, I probably one of these days, it's on my homework. I need to see Canadian Bacon, but it's very relevant to Donald Trump violating international law by threatening Canada and saying that,
and it's the only time. It's the only time I've ever thought of comparing Donald Trump to Alan Alda, because they have nothing in common.
But
Alan Alda did play a very Donald Trumpian president in Canadian Bacon when you look back now.
Exactly. And my over Christmas, I was in Berlin seeing my sister, and she finally finished a Christmas present I gave her 2 or 3 Christmases ago, which was Stephen King's The Dead Zone. Yeah, The Dead Zone. And Stephen King, although he is very, despite his bad politics, he basically says that the book is a warning to America and the world. Do not elect the Donald Trumps of the world to get into power.
Also, let's remember The Dead Zone. Whatever you want to say about Stephen King's reprehensible politics now, The Dead Zone advocates political assassination as a moral good in extreme situations. Just pointing that out.
Yeah. But it's so that and actually it's kind of ironic. It's actually kind of ironic what Trump is doing, threatening Canada with tariffs, threatening that Canada should be the 51st state of the U.S. because. And this is the ironic part. It's like the Liberal Party in Canada is in complete chaos right now, and many people were predicting that if a hypothetical general election was to happen, the Conservative Party of Canada under Pierre Poilievre was going to have a huge comeback. I'm hoping worst case scenario is that if they do have their comeback, it'll at least be a minority government. But with Trump threatening Canada the way he's doing, and him hitting tariffs at a Canada which is mostly controlled. The provinces are all mostly controlled by center-right to far-right premiers. Now, Donald Trump has ironically made Canadians nationalist again. So there's a chance that the Liberal Party might still be in a minority government, and all because Donald Trump, being the idiot that he is, did this, even though he would love to have a Pierre Poilievre in power.
The premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, the Donald Trump of Canada, was actually making anti-Trump noises in public, defending Canadian sovereignty, which is just when Doug Ford is criticizing Donald Trump in Canada, that's bad for Donald Trump in Canada.
And in fact, Alberta, which is the Texas of which is the Texas of Canada, has all the tar sands, all the most dirtiest oil you can imagine. It's Danielle Smith. Many Canadians, even right-wing Canadians, have been attacking her because while there's been this sort of united Canadian fronts against Donald Trump and now Canadian nationalism is sort of cool again. Danielle Smith was nowhere to be there at this big press conference they had. She's been going to Mar-a-Lago, kissing Donald Trump's ass and going please, you can do whatever you want with the other provinces, but we're your friends.
Alberta. Isn't Alberta the home of Pat King and Tamara Lick of the assault on Ottawa?
Yeah, the Freedom Convoy, which luckily didn't result in what happened with January 6th, but it was but that was another thing, speaking of left-ish kind of people
Yes.
providing cover for right-wingers. It was clearly a far-right march. It was clearly a reactionary.
But the gray zone was openly boosting them and claiming that people calling them far-right and Nazi were lying and slandering them and deliberately blowing things out of proportion. It was horrific to see.
Exactly, and there was and the running, and in fact the running joke, because you had all of the leftists in Canada, whether it was the Left Nationalist Organization, Council of Canada, to the far left, like the Communist Party of Canada, were all denouncing the Freedom Convoy and so forth.
Yeah, even the Communist Party of Canada was saying, we kind of think the far right has a point on mask mandates, but fuck these people.
Exactly. And then what was so hilarious, because I remember I recorded a special anti-Canada Day, anti-4th of July special with my good friends Margaret Kimberly of Black Agenda Report and Al Jones, this wonderful racial social justice abolitionist activist and poet and educator, Al Jones. And when Al Jones was talking about about the Freedom Convoy and how like soft Canadian nationalists were so angry because they were all waving like Canadian flags. And I remember like saying to her, wait, Al, are you really saying that the Freedom Convoy weren't these wonderful working class populists that so many of our friends on Twitter and so forth are saying?
It's so gross because, again, the entire left in Canada, regardless of what they thought about vaccine mandates or mask mandates or what have you, or shutdowns or what have you. And let's remember, there were some really squirrely weirdos in the Communist Party of Canada who were getting really, really anti-public health at some points of the COVID crisis.
Oh, not just them, but also like the Green Party,
Yes. But everybody on the left again said, we really don't want to see European style vaccine passports in Canada, but fuck these people.
Exactly, and then what really pissed me off was no offense to Whitney Webb, but Whitney Webb was also propping up like the Freedom
and then none of these people in America would listen to people in Canada that they've platformed and supposedly trust and work with. It's like, why are you ignoring the Canadians who are telling you the truth and acting like this is some unbridgeable mystery that cannot be properly reported from Canada? Just talk to Canadian comrades.
In fact, I had many people contact me that like they were like saying like, Youri, thank you for platforming like voices of reasons when it came to the whole Freedom Convoy, because so many like Canadian leftists were just shocked that outlets like the Gray Zone, even Min Press News, were propping these people up back when Dan Cohen had like his own program. And it was
that's the thing. Dan Cohen worked for Mint Press back then and has since then become an American Communist Party member and has outed himself as a complete right winger. He's defending Infra-Haz on the gun running charges, saying that it's all an op against Haz by the deep state.
Unbelievable, but that's
Ben Rubenstein also. Ben Rubenstein and Dan Cohen went from Gray Zone to American Communist Party, and are just absolutely even more off the rails than they were at the Gray Zone.
Unbelievable, and it pissed me off because I'm not from Canada originally, but I do cover like a lot of like Canadian topics, and it was just shocking to see outlets which rarely cover Canadian topics, not even covering like Canadian like imperialism, propping up what was clearly a bunch of far right assholes. But again, it just goes to show you that we have our work cut out for us when it comes to pushing back against the far right and the far right infiltrating.
And don't worry,
spaces.
Elon Musk also didn't originally come from Canada, but he still got into the country on a Canadian student visa, and we've never been able to get rid of him. Because, of course, his mother is a Canadian.
Is she?
Oh, you don't know who Mae Musk is?
Okay. Maybe the reason why I didn't know this is because when she speaks in interviews, even in documentaries, which are
Yeah.
semi-critical of Elon Musk, she has a very strong Afrikaner accent. So I just
Yeah, she
assumed that,
spent time, but she's originally from Canada, and she was a huge supermodel in the 70s or 80s. And she remained a very successful model well into old age, in defiance of a lot of quote unquote patriarchal gender norms. So she was a big hero with the representational liberal but not necessarily class conscious feminists who didn't pay close attention to the fact that she was married to an Afrikaner who did business in conflict emeralds.
unbelievable.
But that said, yeah, no. So Elon Musk got into the U.S. on because his mom was Canadian, on a Canadian student visa, because Canada also has birthright citizenship.
Yeah.
In his case, just because his mom was a Canadian citizen, because I believe he was born in South Africa.
Crazy.
But anyway, so Elon Musk comes into Canada and then sneaks into the United States across the Canadian border on a Canadian visa. I'm using this language on purpose. I don't actually have any problem with immigration from Canada, but I'm trying to deliberately I'm trying to talk about this the way right wingers would talk about Fernando Valenzuela back in the 80s. So Elon Musk sneaks across the Canadian border on his mother's visa, despite being from South Africa and not Canada. And then gets a job despite being there on a student visa, which means he's now an undocumented worker. And on top of that, he gets a job as an engineer he's not qualified for because he's not actually going to college. He's getting this job instead.
How does all of this get completely missed out in the news, including even the best of left?
People were trying to talk about it for a little while, people were trying to talk about this for a little while, but they were doing it totally the wrong way. The liberal media was doing this little Elon Musk was an illegal immigrant. And obviously that's not going to hit home the way they want it to with the people that they're using that language to make it hit home with. And it's going to piss off actual advocates for immigration, even immigration reform, let alone actual ending the injustice of militarized borders.
Well, what's also interesting. Speaking of like Elon Musk, there is a I don't know how big the clash is, but there is like sort of like far right infighting going right now between like the Steve Bannon cult followers, who want strict, not just strict illegal immigration, but strict legal immigration with the
There are these two very different wings of the American white supremacist movement, and it's very hard to separate them because they agree on almost everything in the end, but there really are divisions that I would love to see come more to the fore, and I think we will if Elon keeps. But anyway, so there's number one, you've got the traditional Nazi types. We call them neo-Nazis, but Nazis is what they are. Exactly. The Nazi types fall into 3 or 4 different groups. Number one, and this is the most important in the United States, the combination of old American money families who supported Nazis before World War II and still support Nazis now, with the descendants of actual Nazis who were brought to America from Europe after World War II. People never really think about actual American Nazis who have always been Nazis and the fact that they raised their kids and grandkids to be Nazis too. But it's real, it's important, it's why Bobby Kennedy Jr. is in the place he is in, because ultimately he is part of that. I hate to use a term from paranoid spy thrillers from the 80s, but it really was prescient. Sonnenkinder.
Yeah.
Now, the Sonnenkinder were a concept touched upon by lots of other writers, but really, really used to great effect in multiple stories by an American named Robert Ludlum.
Mm-hmm.
And Robert Ludlum's books are all about this one of two or three things, with a couple of exceptions that are written just to be funny, which stand in their own special lane. But his stories are either about World War II thrillers, where the bad guys are actual Nazis and Americans collaborating with them, number one. Number two, Cold War thrillers, in which the bad guys are undercover Nazis on the Western side and not Russians.
Interesting.
Three, anti-security state thrillers in which are about some sort of intelligence or counterintelligence operation going off the rails and the human cost of this operation going off the rails. And just out and out, the Nazis are trying to take over the world shit.
Yeah.
Now, what's fascinating about this is that if you read some of his books now, particularly the Aquitaine Progression and the Apocalypse Watch, your reaction is, fuck, this guy's prescient. He was writing about this stuff, and he was dead long before it happened. And it's full of CIA scandals and FBI scandals. His first book, The Osterman Weekend, is about a guy who gets bullied into spying on his possibly communist friends by a CIA agent.
Interesting. Wow. Interesting.
And so it's just fascinating. And he was writing all of this stuff, some of it because of the real CIA scandals of the 70s. But others, this really prescient shit about Nazis in every institution of American life that looks completely paranoid. They even called the genre that he invented paranoid thrillers. And yet, these sort of right-wing conspiracies where everybody's hand in glove behind the scenes because of the way international capital works really exist.
In fact, I'm actually glad you brought that up, because I was talking about this with my parents. I was watching a clip of Euronews, which is the EU-funded media outlet. Not a fan with it. Not a fan of it, but that's another topic for another day.
No, where did Euronews fall on the USAID list?
Oh, very much funded by USAID. Very much funded by USAID, which is one of the many reasons why they depict it as this awful crime against humanity that Donald Trump would cut USAID. But I was very surprised to find out that what was it? That the BBC is also funded to the
USAID was the second biggest funder of the BBC after the British government agency that's responsible for funding the BBC.
But this Euronews report was talking about, so over the weekend, basically like the far right all gathered in Madrid to have their conference about how they can take right now in the Netherlands. It's a right-wing coalition with the far right and the supposedly center right. And Hertz Wilders, who I'm sure your audience knows, who's the right-wing, far-right shock jock, basically gave a keynote speech, either the opening speech or the closing speech, where he basically was saying that the days of Schultz and Macron are over. Marine Le Pen was there. Viktor Orban was there. Vox Populist, this disgusting far-right Spanish party was
and
all
Geert
there.
Wilders, folks, If you don't follow Dutch politics, Geert Wilders is the leader of the whatever the Dutch Nazi Party is calling themselves these days. He was literally persona non grata in the pre-Trump days and was one of the many far-right leaders in Western Europe who suddenly became legitimate after Trump was elected president the first time.
Yeah, when asked what he thought about the Brexit far-right victory and Trump, he simply said, "Fantastic," in that very Dutch, strong Dutch English accent of his. So, but so now the pan-European far right, they call themselves under an umbrella organization called the European Patriots. While all this is going on, the International Democracy Union, this is where all of the center-right to far-right, I mean, center-right, far-right are meaningless terms at this point, but basically these are all the center-right folks like gather around to talk about how.
I mean, we've reached the point. We've reached the point in Western politics where the quote-unquote center-left and the far-right are closer together than the center-left and the far-left. And the reason that's happening is because we're seeing this hyper paranoia from the capitalists who control all the parties right of the far-left.
Exactly.
And you see this in Weimar, Germany, where the man who recruits the Freikorps is not one of the right-wing leaders of the Freikorps who goes on to become a Nazi, but the man who recruits the Freikorps is the Social Democrat President Friedrich Ebert, who is trying to get around restrictions on Germany's standing army by hiring militarized police who can be used to defend Germany against invasion. But then he calls the Freikorps up to use them against his political opponents during the Spartacist Revolution, and the Freikorps gets out of control and shoots Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Then the following year, the Freikorps' leader, Werner von Kapp, tries to take over the government, succeeds in capturing the city of Weimar, which was the capital at the time. That's why they called it the Weimar Republic. Succeeds in taking Berlin, and is only defeated because of a general strike brought about by the left wing of Ebert's Social Democratic Party in order to prevent another attempt of revolution. And so you end up with this reactionary center-left government, reliant on a right wing that tries to overthrow it, but then is unable to completely repress that right wing because it needs that right wing to hold off its own far-left competition.
And just to give you an idea of just how amoral the business community and even this whole, I always think it was fictional, the whole idea of a moderate Republican, because the Republican Party since Abraham Lincoln has always been quite extreme when it comes to basically anyone who's not white, more or less. But Vox, to
be fair about that, it is very important to understand that the Republican Party remained the only place there was any sort of civil rights politics in the American mainstream up until the 1930s and 1940s, when the Black labor movement started to work with Franklin Delano Roosevelt in an oppositional, though cooperationist sort of manner.
Yeah, exactly.
And ironically, it was the leaders of the black labor movement who were oppositional but cooperationist with Roosevelt who later became some of the key founders of the American social democratic movement, despite white people getting most of the credit. Not that social democrats deserve too much credit, but still.
Yeah, and WikiLeaks, Orinoco Tribune reported on this story, and RT also reported on this story, that Vox, this grotesque far-right Spanish party, basically, they get most of their funding from many leading Spanish businesses.
Oh yeah,
and many of these leading Spanish businesses, which depict themselves as being very queer friendly, very feminist friendly, very friendly towards people of all colors in Spain,
they all secretly wish Blanco would come back tomorrow.
Which again goes to show you that like the road to fascism needs two things. It needs liberals to be like, well, I may not like their table manners, but they at least get rid of the far left. And big business, which knows that the far right is going to advance.
When Trump was president the first time, there were people who were saying that we needed to replace American-style democracy, not with actual fascism, but with a quote-unquote liberal dictatorship on the model of the Portuguese new state. Or
unbelievable.
Now keep in mind that these are people writing in the Federalist, which used to be a mainstream conservative paper. And still, I guess, is a mainstream conservative paper, which is frightening if you think about it.
Considering how far right they actually are.
The Federalist is terrifyingly Nazi. I mean, the Federalist is, even before Trump was president in 2016, during the election, the Federalist was publishing Mike Cernovich fantasizing about killing his neighbors in the event of a civil war.
Unbelievable.
Like that the reason that the right would win when the liberals started a civil war, and he always says it's the liberals who are going to start it, which, you know, is a little unrealistic, but hey, whatever. We should be so lucky.
But now I do agree with many of my comrades and friends who do independent left media when they say we need to break up the duopoly, whether it's in Britain, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in the US, Canada, and so forth. But that being said, you can understand why many people feel that the Democrats or the Labour Party of whatever country is their only shield against the far right, because the Republican Party, the Liberal Party of Australia, which is often in coalition with another supposedly center-right party, the National Party, the Conservative Party of Canada, which is actually quite a new party. It was formed with Canadian Alliance, which was the Reform Party rebranded, merged with the Progressive Conservative Party of Brian Mulroney, John Diefenbaker. When that party merged into what's now the Conservative Party, okay, all of these parties in this organization called the International Democracy Union have actually been working to try to build bridges with the far right. And Stephen Harper, who's the chairman of it, has been trying very hard to get Modi and the BJP, which is a Hindu fundamentalist party, to come on, guys, join. Meanwhile, you have Nigel Farage and members of the Conservative Party of Britain trying to do their own new.
I'm willing to bet
this their own kind of like unite the rights.
I'm willing to bet that Canada is going to be like the United States, where there are a surprising number of liberals who also love the BJP and Modi. In the U.S., love for Modi and taking massive amounts of money from the RSS's American affiliates is bipartisan.
Yeah.
Everybody from Chip Roy in Texas, who is as Republican as it gets, to Ro Khanna in California, who's a Bernie Sanders progressive.
And let's not forget the once darling of anti-imperialism, and rightly so, is a toxic person that everybody has disavowed because of her disgusting comments supporting the genocide in Gaza. Who am I talking about? Drumroll, please.
Tulsi Gabbard. Let me ask a question.
And I still can't apologize enough to Abby Martin, her husband Mike, and Robbie Martin, because their red flags were already there about do not trust Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah.
So,
well, Abby Martin was right there on the reporting on the RSS affiliates at the very beginning when she was still in Congress, and it came up in her reelection.
But yeah, no, it's a crazy, dangerous world. And I think the worst thing about Donald Trump's comeback is that is so much of what would outrage people has just become normalized. Like far right jockness, obnoxiousness,
let's know
nationalism has all been completely normalized.
I want to stop and say it hasn't as much as you think. Again, we're having massive ICE protests anti-ICE protests in the United States right now. The difference between the anti-ICE protests we're having now and the anti-ICE protests we were having in 2020 and before that is that it's not in the media anymore. That's the difference. The protests aren't smaller. There are just as many anti-fascists in the streets. They're still setting trash cans on fire at ICE headquarters all around the country, but it's not being reported on in the news the way it was being reported on the news when Trump was president the first time. And that's where it's dangerous, is the media is normalizing this by not covering the protests because they're scared of things like the anti-Israel protests,
which are good protests and which are righteous protests, and I 100% endorse them. And this is where we're in a very strange. This is where we're in very strange terrains, because I know in Britain, for example, much of the left often mobilizes against what they call the far right, and there's always daily protests and always weekend protests against what the conservative government is doing, protesting against Tommy Robinson, protesting against Nigel Farage, and whatever
someone throws a milkshake at someone.
Huh?
Someone throws a milkshake at someone.
Yeah, exactly. Which are good, but my only problem, and this is something that the left constantly makes, they constantly make this mistake, is, okay, that's very good, and it's very good to mobilize people against the far right and the normalization of their grotesque politics, but the Labour government, to quote the late Glenn Ford, is the more effective evil, and
yes.
I still don't see many people in those protests denouncing Keir Starmer and his anti-immigrant policies and stuff like that. But that goes to
that's the trap. That's the trap of the reformist left. It's the same in the UK as it is in the US or Canada. You don't want to break from political respectability. You don't have the courage to open up a militant wing or to boycott your national parliament and only participate in state and local government. So instead, you become cooperationist.
And we see this mistake happening constantly in Canada when it comes to the Liberal Party, who are not our friends. And I mean, the Liberal Party, I mean, for the American
Liberal Party is the original political party of Canada. In Canada, the Liberal Party is the kill the Indigenous people and extract the resources party before there ever was a Conservative Party.
Exactly, and in fact, there's a really good, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because there's a really good documentary which is free to watch online called "Dancing Around the Table," and this was when Canada was coming of age. Constitutional reforms and stuff like that were very, very hot, or very, very big topics amongst Pierre Trudeau's Liberal Party, and even amongst Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservative Party. And in this two-part documentary, it's the Canadian government with all the premiers talking with all of the Indigenous leaders of Canada about how we can reform the Constitution, be friendly with you guys, and advance your interests. And it was very clear Pierre Trudeau was just hardcore anti-Indigenous. Not saying Brian Mulroney was better, but for fuck's sakes, Brian Mulroney at least showed concerns that and actually like really was willing to listen to like their grievances and how do we move forward. Whereas Pierre Trudeau was just like his contempt for Indigenous people, like you could was just so
the far right always needs. I hate to use this I hate to use the World War II language, but it feels like as our society becomes more Nazi, this more and more becomes the right word. And I don't feel that other words really put it as well as this, especially since if you actually read Uncle Tom's Cabin, Uncle Tom is the hero and not servile at all. So that's not really a great word, a great term to use. Plus, it's so very specific. It's so very specific, you don't want to use it for anybody else. Whereas, even though this is almost equally specific, it seems so appropriate in this Nazi age. There are so many capos out there.
Yeah.
There are people who are willing to join that, and the far right needs them. The far right needs people who will stand up and lead their own people into a horrible place. Byron Donaldson of Florida, a MAGA Republican who happens to be a black man, but that doesn't change his politics at all. Byron Donaldson is being normalized on the Bill Maher show now, while Bill Maher pushes back on Chris Hayes for saying that people who have a problem with trans people should just mind their own fucking business. And I want to be clear that basically what Chris Hayes expressed this tremendous frustration that every good person on any sort of progressive side of the argument feels, where he says, at some point, all these people who claim they want a small government and to just be left alone need to mind their own fucking business and leave other people alone. And Bill Maher pushes back like, but is it really their own business? And it's just like,
Yeah, but I'm glad you mentioned Bill Maher, because Bill Maher is that classic, liberal. He's that classic liberal who claims he wants like legalized pot, claims he's a friend to black people and to immigrants and so forth. But when push comes to shove, the whole world could be on fire. But as long as he gets to do what he wants and the police don't like fuck around with him, he'll be fine. With like lynchings and like trans people being like shot like fire squad, because I'm rich and I can take care of myself.
I'm not in any way a fan of Chris Hayes. I don't want to make it sound like I'm praising him too much, but I believe he was expressing
a broken clock could be.
I believe he is expressing what a lot of us who care about queer rights feel when he says, "Hey, at some point, you just got to stop and mind your own business. Stop being a bigot. Shut up. Mind your own business. Who cares?"
But that being said, I've noticed that the left, the real left, however imperfect they may be sometimes, I've noticed that the left has a very hard time of like updating, of updating itself. So, for example, I've heard this from friends of mine, and so I've heard a version of this that, oh, why are people talking all the time about trans rights? First of all, people are not talking that much about trans rights. Or why are people talking so much about racial justice, this? And when we really should be focusing on the class issues and what matters to working class people. That's what's going to unite the left, and then we'll be able to topple whatever right wing agenda. And it simply is not true. First of and I vote, and you keep hearing a version of this everywhere, that there's too much focusing on that liberals and the left, the real left, focus way too much on queer liberation, trans liberation, and it's simply not true. And instead, and when you have the far right engaging in their toxic identity politics, instead of people forcefully pushing back against that, or forcefully pushing back against why the death penalty is stupid and the whole law and order rhetoric, instead of like pushing back against them, there's so much like deer in the headlights where it's like, I don't know how to counter their stupid arguments. I do not know what to do about like abortion. Instead of just like,
cops are working class too. You hear some moron. Sorry, I should not use that word. Some doofus will always come up and say, cops are working class too, when you're in the middle of trashing cops.
So that's something I find frustrating. Another thing I do find frustrating, which I've mentioned on your show a couple of times, when I came on in January, was and again, I believe that we need to smash the two-party system, and we need a broad church of the left, without any toxic bigotry or anything like that. And I still find that there's too often when Trump does his latest outrage of people saying, well, Biden did this, well, Obama did this, and yes, the two parties are evil, but right now Trump is the head of the empire. Trump is the and is the person that we need to be mobilizing.
I have multiple competing ideas here that are all working at the same time. Number one, yes, Trump is in power now. Trump is who we should be mobilizing against. Absolutely. Number two, Trump is in power now because of a system that elevated him now. And the reason it elevated him now is because of everything that happened before him in a historical progression that became deterministic when no one did anything to stop it. Now, for people who don't understand that, that's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. People said in 2020 what Biden would have to do to avoid Trump being president again in 2025. And Biden didn't do it. And that's what a self-fulfilling prophecy is. Now, with that said, I want to get back to the topic of Elon Musk. And to lead into this, one of the things that has changed this year is that back in 2019 or so, the Democrats said they wanted a strong Republican Party. Well, they got their wish, didn't they?
And in that respect, we do have to blame the Democrats for a lot of things, because as the WikiLeaks cables showed when WikiLeaks revealed what the Clinton campaign, the DNC, did to Bernie Sanders, also revealed with the Podesta emails that Hillary Clinton wanted Donald Trump to win because she thought that was the easiest Republican she could beat, unlike a Ben Carson, a Marco Rubio, or a Jeb Bush. Well, be careful what you wish for, because, well, Trump trounced her.
Well, Hillary Clinton was worried there wouldn't be enough difference between her and Jeb Bush. She was really scared of being the nominee because people didn't think Jeb was as stupid as his brother W. And because political wise, Jeb was a far right guy who was always willing to compromise with the center left, and Hillary was a center right person who was always willing to compromise with the far right. So, I mean, they would have had a real hard time distinguishing themselves from each other. You probably would have seen Hillary win in 2016, just simply based on Hillary running against the Bush family in the general election the way Trump ran against the Bush family in the 2016 primary. That said, Trump running against the Bush family in the 2016 primary made it really easy for him to run against Hillary Clinton in the 2016 general.
Yeah, as this sort of like fake outsider and whatnot.
Yes.
Even though for anyone who follows local New York politics, everybody knows that Trump is quite the demon in New York.
and then the whole phenomenon of using political persecution to drive Trump out of politics in the form of prosecution, which is a great precedent. I'm glad a former president has been convicted of a crime. But the jury, because they're a state jury and not a federal jury, and because there is nothing in the federal Constitution that says the president can't be sentenced in a state court, I really believe that the criminal court in New York State was way out of line in closing the case without a sentence. I believe they should have thrown the book at Donald Trump, president-elect or not. I believe they should have given him the maximum sentence, because if you're going to pretend to have a rule of law, then you have to practice what you preach and enforce those laws. Now, the thing is, if Donald Trump had been sentenced, then this opens a floodgate of people who can then criminally charge Barack Obama and George W. Bush, both of whom are still alive, both of whom have committed a multitude of heinous crimes.
Mm-hmm.
And what's more, some of those crimes were Americans, and there were ways that criminal charges could potentially be filed in the state courts where those in the states where those American victims resided.
But that, of course, goes back to why America does need a left-wing revolution, because it goes back to the whole thing of why aren't they more aggressive in going after Trump on the things that they should be going after him about, whatever crime against humanity, conflict of interest. But that's because if they really do go after Trump, if the Democrats really went after George W. Bush and his epic crimes against humanity and his many conflicts of interest, Dick Cheney's many conflicts of interest, they would have to basically also indict themselves.
I've said this many times before. It's come out since 2003, long since now. I mean, I can't remember when the first exposures were. I'm pretty sure it was like 2006, 2007. But regardless, Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden were both fundamentally complicit in helping W lie to other Democrats and to the American people. So when we talk about they lied us into war, we're not just talking about the Bush administration. The they who lied us into war was the Bush administration and the bipartisan leadership of both houses of Congress. The only Democrat who voted against the authorization to use military force in Afghanistan was Barbara Lee.
Credit to her, yeah.
The votes against the Iraq war were very politically damaging to some Democrats. The best example is that Georgia Senator Max Cleland was swift voted out of office by a Republican operative named Rick Wilson, who called him a coward. Yes, Rick Wilson, that same guy, who called him a coward. Who called him a coward for his vote against the Iraq war. Now, I want to be really clear that Max Cleland was a soldier in an imperialist army, and he does not necessarily deserve our respect for anything that he did in Vietnam. Of course, But that said, the man lost both legs and an arm in combat at a time when other people of his class were avoiding combat. You can't call him a coward seriously.
Exactly.
And despite his Vietnam service, he was one of the last liberal Democrats from the South. There hasn't been another Max Cleland since Max Cleland.
And also, and funny enough, and this is
even Raphael Warnock, who of all people should be at least as liberal as Max Cleland, is not Max Cleland.
And actually, and this is where it is important to highlight that the Democrats are as complicit for the mess we're in when it comes to Donald Trump. Is if you look at if you look at Joe Biden's political career, I mean, when both Reagan and George H.W. Bush were in power, even though they got a lot of their evil agenda done, they still did not have full control over the House and the Senate.
The Senate under both Reagan and George H.W. Bush, the Senate was controlled by Democrats. The House was controlled by Democrats. All their bills, every bill that George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan signed was passed by a majority Democratic Congress.
And they did not have to do it. Just like the Supreme Court, George H.W. Bush appointed one of the most knuckle-dragging Neanderthals in the form of Clarence Thomas. And when Anita Hill blew the whistle on his grotesque sexual harassment and perverted behavior, it was Joe Biden, a Democrat, who sided with Clarence Thomas over Anita Hill, paving the way for a Supreme Court which is so far right, so reactionary, so pro-business, an emphasis on pro-business with corporations being, granted personhood and stuff like that. So, yeah. What's the old saying? Scratch a liberal and the fascist bleeds, or something like that, or
something like that. I mean, and there's lots of good solid evidence for it. Any day now, I expect John Fetterman to tell us he's a Republican now.
Because he's so nonchalant and pushing back against anything that
he's so aggressively pro-Israel that it's terrifying.
Oh wow, okay.
I mean, he's undistinguishable from Republicans who are IDF veterans in his rhetoric on Israel.
Unbelievable.
So, I mean, he's that far enough beyond even a lot of other Democrats.
Yeah, crazy. But it is also important, and the one thing so there's two things
and secondly, despite having an undocumented wife, or at least formerly undocumented wife, John Fetterman has also really, really embraced MAGA border policies.
Unbelievable. So I've always said that that there's two things I'm afraid with Trump in power. One is just the inability to push back against the far right agenda of his, but the other one is people attacking Donald Trump from the right. This is a perfect segue for USAID. Now, USAID, I'm not exaggerating when other people say, is a CIA front. There's no other words.
So for some historical context for what's going on with USAID. USAID is a creation of the late 70s, 1980s attempt to reform the national security state in the fallout of Watergate and the various CIA scandals that boiled up during the Ford administration in the aftermath of Watergate. The outcome of all these scandals was the Church Commission, which was a Senate committee, bipartisan, chaired by a liberal Democrat named Frank Church, who was a little bit over anti-communism as an excuse for every horrific thing that the U.S. government wanted to do. And I mean, we're not talking about somebody who was a radical leftist. We're talking about somebody who's a fairly ordinary security state liberal of his day in most ways. But in the end, he's tired of seeing, he didn't think the U.S. should be running death squads in Vietnam or fighting a dirty war in South America. He thought this was incompatible with the liberalism of his parents.
Yeah.
And so Church, despite not being a radical or a communist, really, really took it aggressively to the CIA in these hearings. And a lot of shit came out. And some laws were passed that further restrained the CIA. And in order to get around some of those restraints, USAID was created specifically to do some of the things that had been done directly by the CIA before. And what's more, when the CIA did it, it was always subversive and bad. There was no way you could spin it as being a good thing for a country that the CIA was killing people. But if USAID was giving money to quote-unquote pro-democracy groups, then all you had to do was deny that the pro-democracy groups were actually the people killing people for the government.
Exactly. And I mean, USAID, just like the National Endowment of Plutocracy, the National Endowment of Democracy, basically does what the CIA, it does what a lot of the CIA does when it comes to like infiltrating unions, when it comes to aid, but aid with strings attached, meaning you guys got to get rid of these rabble-rousers that might sabotage an arms deal or something, or might get in the way when we want to overthrow an Assad in Syria, a Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, or the Party of Regions of Viktor Yanukovych of Ukraine. That's where USAID and the National Endowment of Democracy does.
I think USAID really did everything they could to keep Hosni Mubarak in power, and that's why we ended up with Sisi in the end, to be fair.
But it's crazy how the media.
And I also want to reiterate that it was W. Bush who made Bashar al-Assad a key U.S. ally so that we could send people to secret prisons in Syria to be tortured.
Exactly.
And Barack Obama did not terminate that relationship until Arab Spring made it politically convenient to support ISIS in Syria.
But the Arab Spring, there are still some, including like the best folks from the Middle East who report.
Tunisia is still defying imperialism.
No, but the Arab Spring, it's funny because I take the more cynical, pessimistic view that it was just one giant color revolution. You only have to look at who got successfully overthrown and who didn't come to that conclusion.
So if you want to look at who successfully got overthrown and who didn't, that's another story. I want to talk about the Arab Spring itself before any co-optation or counter-revolution.
Okay.
Because that's important. Okay. The Arab Spring itself starts in Tunisia.
Yeah.
And that Tunisian revolutionary state still exists and is still defying imperialism. Now, we can say that it's not everything we want it to be, but the U.S. government is going out of their way to make a big deal about horrific the Tunisian government is, despite the fact that the Tunisian government is trying very hard to undo a lot of the damage done to the region by what happened in Libya.
That's actually gets cost. I actually did not know about that, so that's actually quite news to me. Interesting.
So that's number one. The U.S. government is still targeting the Tunisian government that took power in the Arab Spring ever since.
Okay.
Calling their leader a strong man, referring to them with all the buzzwords for totalitarianism because he won't let their capital in the way he wants. So that's number one. That's where the Arab Spring started, Tunisia. Then we moved to Yemen, where the Arab Spring started a democratic movement that broke down into the current civil war, with the Houthis essentially being the democratic side of the movement ultimately.
Yeah.
So that's another reason I say it's not exactly a color revolution. There
Okay.
was an attempted color revolution in Yemen. They managed to get sort of a semi-soft pro-Western president elected. But as the Civil War wore on, the allegedly pro-Western president defected to the Houthi.
Interesting.
So that has to be taken. So that's number two, Yemen. And that's the second reason that I want to say the Arab Spring wasn't a big color revolution.
Okay, fair enough.
The third is Saudi Arabia, where the present strongman MBS essentially became power because of U.S. efforts to help the Saudi royal family crush the Arab Spring in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Because everyone forgets that they were outside the palace screaming for the heads of the royals during the Arab Spring. And the Saudi Arabian royal family were pissing themselves, begging CIA to save them. That's another reason I say the Arab Spring wasn't just a big color revolution.
Okay, that's fair enough.
And then comes Egypt, where
it got restructured, where Western imperialism got restructured.
So what happened? Well, there was a straight-up counter-revolution. The Arab Spring resulted in a democratic coalition whose leader, as the most respected anti-imperialist politician in the country, it only makes sense, was the president of the Islamic Brotherhood. But he was the most respected, longest-serving pro-democracy party leader in the country. So, I mean, who else was going to be the leader of the pro-democracy movement in the end? We can like it or not, but who else was it going to be?
Which is interesting, given that the Muslim Brotherhood tends to play a pretty reactionary role in international state of affairs.
Yeah, sure. But has always been quote unquote liberal in Egyptian politics vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
But that also goes to show why you didn't have like a big like secular left alternative.
Yes.
Is unfortunately because the West with the Muslim Brotherhood basically eradicated the secular left.
The West helped the Muslim Brotherhood. The West used the Muslim Brotherhood against Nasser.
Yeah.
And then betrayed them to Sadat.
Exactly.
And then used them, and it was the betrayal of the Muslim Brotherhood to Sadat that made the Muslim Brotherhood sort of move into their anti-Mubarak position. It was, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood that shot Sadat.
And many Muslim Brotherhoods, including the second in command of Al-Qaeda that were part of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, against that counter-revolution against the communist government there.
Yes. But the Muslim Brotherhood is a complicated mess because on the one hand, it's genuinely anti-imperialist on one level, but on the other hand, it's a reactionary religious organization that is essentially, I hate to use the word because because it was invented to describe something that's not real, but it is real in the right context. The Muslim Brotherhood, like ISIS, is essentially Islamofascist.
Exactly.
But
I also
those
hate
are the
using that
groups.
term because Christopher Hitchens coined it. But what else can you describe it?
Those are
But
those, but those are the groups that the U.S. traditionally supports, the Sunni Islamofascists.
exactly. And US and yeah, and like I said, USAID was behind so much of the counter revolution to color revolution to just straight up meet the new boss, same as the old boss, the
And
bootlicker for
and
Western America.
look at Al Sisi. Al Sisi, who is the one who put down the Arab Spring in Egypt for the U.S. The president, the democratically elected president of Egypt, the first one since Gamal Abdel Nasser, the democratically elected president of Egypt, died in prison
Under horrific conditions,
under
whereas I think
extremely horrific conditions, probably being tortured.
yeah. Oh no, no doubt about that. Meanwhile, Hosni Mubarak, who was supposed to be, the reason why this revolution, grassroots shigamajig happened, got out of prison, and I don't know if Hosni Mubarak is dead, but he's definitely in a very peaceful setting right now,
Let
out
me
of
look
the
at something real quick because that's a good question, and I don't know. So now I want to see. Let's look.
But yes, USAID, has been behind all sorts of
He
caused
died
some.
in He died 5 years ago now, February of 2020.
I'm surprised that was not bigger news, and I should have known about that. But
It would have been bigger news if Donald Trump, if Donald Trump was not up for re-election in 2020, if you really
oh
think
yeah.
about it.
But that being said, I'm still surprised though how many people don't know that USAID is a front for the CIA, and I think it just goes to show you. And I'll give my anecdote example in a minute, but I think it also goes to show you that while it's important that we have people who are critical thinkers and a critical mass in order to advance, an anti-imperialist agenda, we still have many people who for whatever reason, still tune into corporate news outlet or Western state media outlets, always defending on what country they're in and their preference. Because when I was talking with my parents about Trump supposedly closing USAID, I said to them that it's a CIA front group, and they got very, very angry that I mentioned that. But I said to them that it's true, and I was basically almost sort of dismissed as cranky lefty conspiracy theorist. And in fact, a friend of mine, Saheli Chowdhury of Orinoco Tribune, mentioned this on her WhatsApp. She says, "I was called a conspiracy theorist even by people close to me for saying that Hamajig media is a big mafia, all tied to the same knots. Funny thing is that even CIA operatives openly declared this a long time ago, and yet I am a conspiracy theorist. Bottom line, don't trust mainstream media."
So as for what happened to Hosni Mubarak in the revolution, he spent about 6 years in custody over the course of various criminal offenses. He was convicted of some things that he was convicted to serve 4 years in prison at one point, but he was acquitted in 2017 of conspiring to kill protesters and was released. And he lived rather comfortably in a Cairo military hospital for 3 more years.
Yeah. Imperialism, so geniusly evil.
And apparently he was in poor health in 2010, just before everything started in 2011, and was already talking about his succession. And that appears to have been one of the biggest reasons he was so vulnerable in Egypt. He didn't have a successor at the time. Well, now Mubarak has a successor.
Al-Sisi. And you know how America loves their far right military juntas.
And it's just funny. Mubarak supported al-Sisi while Mubarak was still locked up, and after al-Sisi came into power, Mubarak wasn't locked up anymore for too much longer.
But that being said, do you think? But that being said, the defense of U.S. AID and even Murray Brewster, who's like this pro imperialist CBC journalist, was defending USAID and was attacking the people who are saying that it is a CIA front group as cranky conspiracy theorists. But the response from my parents when I said that USAID is a CIA front group, or the story I was sharing of my friend Saheli when she was saying to people that USAID is a CIA front group, I think it goes to show you that although we have left-leaning people, and although we have people who are critical of the state of affairs, people are still not getting the vital information they need that this is an imperial front group, that is an imperial front group, this group are the enemies from within, this union, do not trust them, this left-wing outlet, do not trust them either, or take them at least with a grain of salt. Be careful when you watch Al Jazeera, because Al Jazeera is Qatari funded okay, you don't have to glorify this guy, but still we need to mobilize against imperialism, which I think goes to show you that we have people who are critical thinkers, but we still don't have people who have been completely decolonized from all of the avalanche of propaganda they get from whatever outlet they consume, and it could be BBC, CNN, CBC, to whatever.
I mean, ultimately, in the minds of any believer, anybody who deep down in the end believes in some sort of racially dictated manifest destiny, they see the potential failure of the Israeli state as a slippery slope that threatens the United States and Australia and Canada and their existence.
Meaning?
Well, I mean, so if Palestine can be free,
yeah,
then the Salish can be free, or the Dakota can be free.
Yes. In fact, actually, no. It's actually quite remarkable how, because sometimes you really have to dig deep into the mindset. Like, why is it the Israelis just don't treat the Palestinians as equal? Why are they even so
now
trying to even sabotage the only just way forward, which is the democratic secular one-state solution? And I think it all goes back to the fact that of the mindset of Western hegemony. It does have its different factions, but they all more or less believe in the same thing. Like, we cannot possibly make Israel, our Western outpost ethnocracy, into this wonderful multicultural thing you crazy lefties believe in, because that means we have to completely decolonize
the contradiction,
our colonial states and our
the contradiction. The central contradiction of Western civilization is that a multicultural society with liberal democratic conditions requires an ethno-state. Now, I don't like that. That's terrifying to me. But I want to note that Sweden just last week had the worst mass shooting in its history. This was on Tuesday. The cops in the town in Sweden where this mass shooting occurred on Tuesday initially said, barely 24 hours after the shooting, well, yeah, this was an unemployed 35-year-old Swedish man who shot up an adult education center where they teach Swedish as the second language to Bosnian and Syrian immigrants, but we don't think it was politically motivated. A couple days later, the lead investigator on the case, who had distanced herself quietly from the original findings, said flat out, officially, I don't know why they said that. We're keeping all possibilities open, and we're not ruling anything out. Which is as close as you'll ever come to a cop saying the political people were full of shit and just couldn't shut up.
Exactly. And the other interesting thing about Sweden, which has a which like the other Nordic countries, has actually a pretty good anti-Zionist movement and fairly good Palestine solidarity movement.
Sweden also has a tradition of Nazism and anti-immigrant politics.
Well, and also when we talk about Greenland, which I'm shocked that even the best left outlets like Breakthrough News don't mention this, but Greenland is settler colonialism. Greenland is a population of indigenous Inuit people who have faced successive racial persecutions under Denmark.
Absolutely.
Most of the time under social democrat stuff.
Of course.
So yeah.
And yet, and I say this and yet because I want to point it out, that Greenland is ruled by a ethnically indigenous prime minister who is a complete comprador for the Danish Empire.
Exactly. But you always have that with imperialism. You always have like the colonial viceroys, which is basically what.
Well, the colonial viceroys used to be Danish, and now they're Greenlanders.
Yeah, but that's what's happening in Palestine as we speak. Like the West Bank, which is under the control of Fatah / the PLO, is nothing more than the colonial viceroy to the Israeli ethno state, or however.
Sadly true. It's the proper term in Afrikaner, if I remember correctly, is I hate it when I can't. Bantustan.
Yes, exactly.
And yet, Greenland is a Bantustan at this point.
And yet, what do we have coming from our supposedly critical mass left-leaning folks? Is you still find them defending the West. The West is the best. Western civilization and liberal democracies. And yes, we've done some awful things in the past, but come on, this is the best system that we have, and we just got to reform it.
I try to be very critical of so-called Western civilization in my work.
Yeah.
I believe that the only way to understand Western civilization is to deconstruct it, and I apologize to any Marxists who don't think that deconstruction is dialectic. You can't have a dialectic until you break something down to its basic components.
Because you have somebody like Bernie Sanders who never props up a Latin American social democratic country. He'll often prop up the Nordic model and so forth, but that Nordic model comes with a lot of apartheid towards the indigenous Sami people,
now
certainly against their own
when
people.
When he was mayor of Burlington, he did prop up the Sandinistas.
Yeah.
When he was mayor of Burlington, he did go to the Soviet Union and prop up the USSR. I do want to give him credit for that. That said, that energy has been missing ever since he went to the Senate.
Unfortunately. But which I find, but that's something which I still find quite remarkable, and I think for that you have to give our enemies credit where it's due when it comes to propaganda, because if you look at Dutch colonialism, if you look at French colonialism, you look at well, how the United States was founded as the ultra-settler colonialism of all settler colonialisms, although Australia gives both Canada and the U.S. and New Zealand a run for its money. And you think, okay, what has this wonderful Western civilization with all of its liberalism and so forth, what has that brought to most of humanity? Pain, genocide, economic exploitation, economic theft, and so forth. I mean, many African Marxists rightly say that Europe would completely fall apart if they weren't still doing the scramble for Africa and the scramble for Asia.
The country, I mean,
and yet you still have people who know all of this. Like, this isn't like
let's go with France.
Still prop up the West is the best and so forth.
Let's
go
with
very
France.
Angry, at folks like you and me when we rightly push back against that thesis.
I'm gonna talk about France, and I'm gonna talk about why Macron made good with the Republican Party and the
Party of France, right?
And I can't say, and the actual nationalist right instead of the far left, despite the far left winning the election by a plurality. And what it came down to was France is making a whole lot of money selling nuclear power, or more specifically, electricity generated by nuclear power across the border into Germany. And they are making this money because the Ukraine war has shut down Germany's normal energy sources from Russia and Ukraine. So France is making a fortune off electricity being sold across the border into Germany from nuclear power stations in France. Now, France has the best developed nuclear power infrastructure in Europe, despite not mining any uranium in France. Where does the uranium come from?
Africa.
Exactly. West Africa. Like more than half of it just from Niger.
Which we've seen an African Spring, a true African imperialist, slightly Pan-Africanist spring, which it still is in development. Whether it'll go full Thomas Sankara or Patrice Lumumba still has yet to see, but so far on a good direction.
I mean, Botswana was talking about nationalizing lithium production. That's a good first start.
And of course, with the rise of China, which I do not subscribe as rival imperialists, so forth, although one can always criticize how the energy is extracted and if it goes into the hands of the people that needs it.
So what I hate to talk about China too much, because I feel like talking about China drags energy out of what we should be talking about.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I feel like China, being too pro-China, forgets the fact that China is a part of the international neoliberal order, best reflected by the fact that despite their flirting with anti-Western trade blocs, and despite their being forced to find other markets and sources for resources since Trump's trade wars, you still have China that, again, doesn't do anything to help Cuba, doesn't do anything to help the Palestinians, really, doesn't do anything to help revolutionary socialist movements in Latin America or Africa, despite supporting anti-American trade deals with specific African countries. So I get very uncomfortable when I see people get too stridently pro-China, because ultimately China is part of the system we're fighting. We may not like that, but they're not actively doing anything to help the people that the empire is destroying. They are simply trying to maintain their position within the empire and their status as a regional power as they see it. Now, people don't like it when I say this about China, but in the end, it's true. But this fight about China with people with whom I otherwise agree does not serve any productive purpose.
Well, I would only push back a little bit as we've fallen into that trap, but I promise I won't spend too much time talking about it. But I would only push back a little bit in that China actually has been helping out Cuba modernize its electric grid to defy the embargo. China, I agree with you, though, that China could do much better on Palestine by first engaging in full-on BDS against
the problem,
Israel and advancing the one-state solution.
The problem,
but at the same time, China, at least the current leadership,
all the CCP has to do is renounce their party's position on Zionism, and everything else would fall into place. Unfortunately, the CCP is officially pro-Zionist. You know that, right?
Well, what I was going to say was that China falls into the problems. Okay, so
the national question.
Well,
the problem of the national question.
Well, the current Chinese leadership, to a default, basically their number one thing when it comes to foreign policy is we respect everyone's sovereignty.
Yes.
So China will not go out of its way to criticize America for its settler colonialism towards the Native American.
Of course.
When they do criticize Canada for its settler colonialism, it's when Canada brings up the stupid thing about Uyghur genocide and stuff like that.
Well, as you can
China
see,
does respect all countries' sovereignty in Africa. It doesn't help that their businesses are complicit in the horrors that we see Rwanda and Uganda inflicting on Congo. So that's where there are some criticisms where criticism is due when it comes to China. But that's because China's current foreign policy dogma is respecting other people's sovereignty, regardless of how
even beyond
reactionary it is.
But their current foreign policy dogma makes absolute sense in the context of a social democracy trying to accommodate itself to liberalism as best it can, while remaining a social democracy in the classical sense.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
I wouldn't so much characterize like that, but that is basically what, because they don't want war, but they know that's
and ultimately, that classical social democracy is in the end the same sort of compromise with liberalism you saw under Stalin. The real horror of Stalinism was not the purge of the old Bolsheviks, though that was not a good thing by any means. The real horror of Stalinism was the Popular Front and the abandonment of the development of the far left in the West to accommodationism with liberals in order to try to make liberals feel more comfortable with the Soviet Union as a fellow liberal country.
Although in fairness to Stalin, yes, I'm going to be Stalin's lawyer, he did try to have a united front against Hitler, but ultimately...
Well, that was the whole point of the Popular Front, to oppose Hitler. And the West, but the whole tragedy of the Popular Front is the West never went along with it.
Exactly.
And the whole tragedy of Stalinism is that despite knowing that the West was never really going along with it, Stalin never completely abandoned it, even at the height of the Cold War.
In fact, actually, funny that you mentioned this because I'm trying to do a show. I'm trying to think of who the guest is going to be, but I want to do a show pushing back against the whole thesis of the whole non-aligned movement and why it doesn't matter, guys, whether you officially are not an ally of Russia under whatever government Russia has. Western imperialists don't give a shit, and they're going to get you whether you like it or not. So man up and vote.
Indonesia was a member of the non-aligned movement and not the Soviet bloc. India was a member of the non-aligned movement and not the Soviet bloc. Did we see the West do anything to help their non-aligned socialist parties achieve any sort of long-lasting socialist institutions, or did they comprador them into liberalism?
They didn't just comprador them into liberalism; they comprador them into neoliberalism. But it's funny. I recently had Dimitri Lascaris on the show to talk about Israel and Greece, Cyprus, the European Union, and France's complicity in the suffering of Palestinians.
Yes.
And I was reading this article on Declassified UK. And the headline is this: revealed, Britain secretly turned non-aligned Cyprus into a key NATO asset. And let me just read you this fantastic sentence, which ends the which is why we shouldn't. Which is why it doesn't give a who gives a shit if, about the non-aligned movement, and that's this.
The whole reason for supporting the reactionary Greek claim to Cyprus was the Cypriot Revolution.
Yeah. But the end of the article says this: Cyprus stayed a member of the non-aligned movement until 2004, when it was required to leave upon joining the EU, but it remains the only EU country that is neither a member of NATO or its affiliated Partnership for Peace program. Yeah. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter, guys. Like, imperialism is the enemy, and so...
And this, people get, here's where you get back into the fact that even during the Cold War, there was this imperialist tension and this nationalist tension between communists, where the only countries with any sort of internal legitimacy to their communist regimes were Yugoslavia and Albania. Mm-hmm. All the other communist countries in Eastern Europe existed because of Soviet occupation and Stalin propping up the communist parties in those countries and putting them in power.
Yeah.
Whereas in Yugoslavia and Albania, the communists came to power during their own revolution during World War II and achieved control of their own countries before either the Allies or the Soviets occupied them.
And yet,
ultimately, the Albanians and the Yugoslavians ended up enemies over competing nationalist border claims that saw Albania join the Stalinist bloc, despite having its own internal communist tradition and not necessarily needing to join the Stalinist bloc. Why? Because they were scared of an invasion from Yugoslavia.
And for all of Yugoslavia's non-alignment, sorry, here's some noise.
Yeah, we froze up there for a moment. Hopefully Youri will be back in a second or two. That's the one trouble of a show where a co-host is in Belgium, but hopefully we'll be back in a sec. But but yeah, even non-aligned Yugoslavia cooperated with the West in all sorts of Cold War shenanigans. I'm sure that's what Youri was going to say before he froze. And Tito was always sort of very friendly with certain elements of the British and American security states because they had funneled support for him because they were scared of Stalin. So, yeah, the non-alignment was an excuse for Yugoslavia to sort of pal around with the U.S. and make certain concessions with capital. And some of the things that happened in Yugoslavia that people speak well of as far as socialist development were only possible because of compromises with Western capital that ultimately weakened the state when the Cold War was over, and there wasn't a strategic use for a socialist Yugoslavia anymore, which is where you get into Michael Parenti's analysis of the breakup of Yugoslavia and the civil war in Bosnia-Herzegovina and things like that, which I strongly recommend, even if I don't agree with all of Parenti's conclusions about Yugoslavia under Milosevic. Hopefully, Youri will be back in a moment or two, but I can manage to talk for a moment or two longer, I think. I said earlier, the Democrats said they wanted a strong Republican Party, and now they've got it. The Democrats were performing weakness again, claiming they were protesting at the State Department, but letting themselves be told they couldn't get in by one guy with no official status, and not just moving him out of the way and going inside anyway to do what they were there to do, which they, as congresspeople and senators, had every constitutional right to do. No, instead we see this posturing of strength on the part of the Trump administration and this performance of weakness on the part of the Democrats in response. And when you really think about it, it's kind of scary. The Republicans perform strength for their constituents to show them, hey, we're fighting for you. And the Democrats perform weakness for their constituents, asking them to save them. And in this difficult time, I don't think it's politically sustainable to be dependent on your voters to save you all the time. Your voters need to feel like you're fighting for them. And the Republicans, with their projection of strength, their performance of strength, are appealing to the fears and weaknesses of their white nationalist constituency. Whereas the Democrats' performance of weakness does not give any confidence at all to the marginalized people who need people in power to protect them.
I completely agree with that statement.
Welcome
Anyways,
back.
before my internet cut me off, no, I was just going to say that Yugoslavia, for all of its non-aligned movements and having good relations between not really being part of the Warsaw Bloc or being part of the pro-American Western blocs, America and its allies still betrayed them and helped to divide and conquer and destroy Yugoslavia. So.
Yes. Whether you completely agree that Slobodan Milosevic deserves to be exonerated or not, Michael Parenti makes excellent points about the Bosnian genocide of Serbs, which generally gets ignored by people who love to talk about the Serbian genocide of Bosnians. They love to ignore the Croatian genocide of both Serbs and Bosnians. They love to ignore everything but Slobodan Milosevic.
Exactly. Who apparently also once upon a time was also very friendly with the U.S. before he came into power, which again
Milosevic,
show you
for whatever for whatever his faults. Milosevic was trying to maintain a unified Yugoslavia for the purpose of maintaining the socialist system that maintained the material interests of the majority of people in Yugoslavia, regardless of their national identity.
Yeah.
That said, as Yugoslavia broke up, Milosevic more and more was forced to identify with Serbian nationalists who were the only real remaining support for a unified Yugoslavia ruled by a communist party that was still mostly Serbian.
Yeah. Apparently, actually, no, I'm not going to comment on this because I don't have because I need to double check the sources. But that being said, it's actually quite funny when you look at the irrationality that comes with Western imperialisms, for example, because the West has been trying in particularly 3 countries, that's Serbia, Bulgaria. Well, actually, I'll just go with Serbia and Bulgaria for as those 2 examples. But these are 2 examples of countries where it doesn't matter how much you eradicate like the left there, they're always going to have a friendly kinship with their Russian counterparts for whatever reason, cultural reasons, historical reasons, and so forth. And every time like the far right or some eccentric right-wing government gets into power in Bulgaria or Serbia, they still want to remain friendly with Russia, and the West does not understand that, so they constantly like meddle into like Serbia.
Let's remember
to fuck things up.
The young Bosnia movement, which assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and helped start World War I.
Yeah.
The Young Bosnia movement conspired with the Russian secret police to assassinate the Archduke to help start World War I. And the ambassador to the Russian ambassador to Serbia tipped off the French ambassador to Serbia that the assassination was going to take place, so that France would be prepared when the war started. So there was this, which is ironic when you consider what happened to the Russian Empire as a result of the war. It's kind of karmic.
Exactly. Again, be careful what you wish for.
But yeah, no, they
I can say.
But the young Bosnian movement were Bosnian Serbs who wanted a Serbian kingdom centered in Bosnia that also included Albania, and were some of the worst Serbian nationalists of their day, and they were in bed with the Russian emperor.
Unbelievable.
Now remember that the whole underlying rationale for the Balkan Wars was the notion of pan-Slavism. And this was the whole point of Serbian and Croatian independence in the first place, and Montenegrin and Bosnian independence. This whole notion of pan-Slavism. And in the end, pan-Slavism was an op by the Russian secret police to build Russian influence in the Austrian Empire. With the intent of fighting a war to liberate the Slavic peoples of the Austrian Empire from the Germans.
Interesting.
Now, this is the rationale behind World War I, ultimately. And it really backfired for the Russian military-industrial complex.
Yeah. And all of those, and of course, Russia, which always kind of had that kind of sick man of Europe aurora to it.
The reason and why did they want to go to war with Austria and Germany? Because Germany had African resources and Russia didn't. Russia had been locked out of the race for Africa.
Yeah. But Russia also, but Russia also. Actually, it's kind of funny because the whole like sick man of Europe was often attached to
The Ottoman Empire.
the waning days though of the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire wasn't always very
At one
reactionary
point, the Ottoman Empire was the most powerful political polity in Europe, but that's a whole nother story.
Yeah, and there was a period of time. Not saying that colonialism was good, but there was a period of time where actually their Christian subjects and their Jewish subjects of whatever European origin or Greek origin were treated as equals. But it was when the Ottoman Empire was starting to decline that it became the sick man of Europe. And Russia too,
the Turks were the opposite.
And Russia regime also had that sick of Europe element to it because they were always, considered, politically quite backwards and far too aggressive towards their subjects compared to liberal democracies of England and France.
It's kind of funny though, because in a sense, the Ottomans were very much the opposite of colonialists in the sense that to a great degree, they left the local government structures in place and kept their hands off and didn't mess with the local economic structures very much. And you can say this about the Islamic empires in general, is that they were not colonialist in the sense that they looted countries for their resources in the Western sense, or that they genocided the people who lived there for the most part in the Western sense. You see the Ottoman genocides happening in the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire at the very end. You don't see genocides in the thriving strength of the Ottoman Empire. In fact, the Ottomans were very assimilationist. After the capture of Constantinople, Mehmed II declared himself the Emperor of Rome and moved his capital to Constantinople.
There is a reason why there is a period in the Ottoman Empire under the ruler Suleiman the Magnificent, where there was lots of investments in science, and it was a golden age of science and mathematics.
The reason that Suleiman's army defeated the Austrians and conquered the Kingdom of Hungary was because they were actually more modern. Their military was more modern than the Eastern European militaries. And the reason they kept winning wars against the Russians and the Austrians for years was the Ottomans had a modern European army, and the Austrians and the Russians didn't.
Sorry about that. Completely.
In fact,
yeah.
That was one of the defining, even though at that point the Ottomans were the sick old man of Europe, one of the defining facts of the Crimean War is that the Ottoman Empire's army was more modern than the Russian Empire's army.
And this is also why a lot of countries with a majority Muslim population call out the Nobel Prize and economics and whatever subject in science, because they say you guys constantly overlook the scientific achievements we made in our country because you guys think that we're all backward Muslims, which is not true. And then ironically, the Soviet Union under, that disgusting ideology that's as evil as Nazism, communism, was actually a civilizational upgrade for them. And when the USSR dissolved and all those countries became quote-unquote democracies, that's why the expression my friend Boyan often uses when we talk about the end of the Cold War and the end of communism was that it was a civilizational downgrade for places like Bulgaria and all of Eastern Europe.
Well, it's like one of the things that David Graeber talks about is how the market culture of the Islamic world was so very different from Western capitalism, despite being a market culture. And that the focus on profits and exploitation of labor is completely missing from that Islamic market culture. Which is not to say that that any culture is perfect or that we should idealize any culture. But the things that we call Western capitalism that drive Western colonialism are missing from Islamic imperialism. The Islamic empire was spread by a relatively small group of people who were divided into two groups: elites who segregated themselves from the society and didn't mess much with the institutions that were there, but instead operated through them. And, the ordinary run-of-the-mill soldiers who became merchants and traders and integrated into these societies. So you don't have Islamic colonialism so much as you have a country becomes part of the Muslim empire because of military and political reasons, and then blossoms on a social and economic level that makes it embrace the certain portions of the Islamic culture too. And you see this sort of fusion result.
In fact, now reading about the history of Armenia, although Armenia definitely had what the Young Turks did to them, and again,
yes,
the waning days of the Ottoman Empire was horrific, and I don't ever want to try to minimize that, but way before that, the Armenian population who wanted to find a better life and so forth would go to other parts of the Ottoman Empire, like Syria, like Iraq, where they actually were treated pretty good.
Armenian Christians formed an elite international gentry in the Ottoman Empire, along with Palestinian Christians.
Exactly. Which is sort of funny because we're talking about like one of like the oldest Christian civilizations, and yet even when the Young Turks genocide happened, they were mostly given a pretty cold shoulder amongst the British, the Germans, and the French, whereas in Syria and in Iraq, their culture actually blossomed, Lebanon as well, and in yours truly, historic Palestine.
I mean, the whole notion of Arab nationalism starts in Palestine after World War I, after the failure of Greater Syria, which would have included Palestine and which was the focus of Arab nationalism from the beginning of the Great Arab Revolt to the French invading Syria and undermining the whole Pan-Arabian project that the British had pretended to support in order to win World War I.
Which I think also says a lot about like the West constantly throwing their Christian brethren under the bus and so
the British you played the Hashemites off against the Ottoman Empire, then let the French and the Saudis destroy the Hashemites, then rescued the Hashemites from the French and Saudis in order to use them again. It's just gross.
I know, no, yeah, it's quite unbelievable, but such as the infinite evil that is Western imperialism.
And it was Palestinians and ordinary Syrians and ordinary Lebanese, the people who were the originators of the Greater Syria movement in the first place, who paid the price for the betrayals of the Hashemites by Western forces. In the end, the Hashemites were okay. The British made sure of that. They took care of them.
Yeah.
Now there's an Englishman who's king of Jordan as a result. I mean, in a sense, starting with King Hussein all of the kings of Jordan since have been, all the kings of Jordan since Hussein have been British, starting with Hussein himself.
It's quite remarkable, but that's because Jordan simply has a better Jordan has a better like propaganda PR system than say the Ba'ath Party of Iraq or the Ba'ath Party of the Assads, because most people, honestly, even people who do elementary research and wanting to be anti-imperialist, a lot of them think that Jordan is actually one of the best friends of the Palestinians when they could not be more complicit bastards.
The reason Jordan exists, is so that there is a reactionary and yet liberal secular Hashemite buffer between the Baathists of Syria and the Baathists of Iraq. That was the original purpose for Jordan.
And that's
to create a conservative influence in a Baathist region.
And that is where you can give credit to the kingdom of Jordan, is that when it comes to secular liberalism, of course, it's not like it's not a queer liberationist like Utopia, but yeah, it is socially. They are certainly much more liberal than their regressive counterparts when we talk about Saudi Arabia.
It's like the United States. It's like the United States used to be before Trump, in that women could vote and join the military. Now that said, in Jordan, elections don't mean very much.
Exactly. And they're as anti all things leftism as they come and so forth.
Well, I mean, the fundamental, one of the fundamental pillars of monarchy is some degree of conservatism and opposition to popular government, even as simple as bourgeois liberalism, because even the bourgeois need to know their place.
Exactly. But that being said, Jordan, definitely one of the countries in the Middle East I wouldn't mind visiting. Syria, well, that's definitely going to be off my list.
Not anytime in the near future. Not now that ISIS is in charge.
Exactly.
Now, one of the interesting facts that I find in the region is the government of Lebanon that took power after the so-called ceasefire. The president of Lebanon,
the government of Lebanon, you mean?
The president of Lebanon took office calling of an end to the occupation of the Golan Heights and promising to end the Israeli occupation of Lebanon, which is a remarkable thing to hear from a Christian, because you remember the rules in Lebanon require the president and commander-in-chief of the military to be a Maronite Christian. So it's a tremendous thing to hear from a Christian in Lebanon to say that he's going to end the Israeli occupation. That's a new twist.
But I think that has more to do with the
fact that it's worth noting that he was elected and took power after an invasion in which the majority of victims were Christians.
Yeah, but I think
second, the incoming prime minister of Lebanon, which is even more important because the prime minister is the head of government.
Mm-hmm.
And the prime minister under the Lebanese constitution has to be a Shiite Muslim. The prime minister of Lebanon...
Unless you're a member of Hezbollah, though.
The incoming prime minister of Lebanon was the president of the International Criminal Court in 2024. Now, what was the International Criminal Court doing in 2024 that might have led Israel to invade Lebanon?
Oh, they made that ruling. Netanyahu and Gallant are both.
Now, I just think this is something that hasn't been talked about a lot in the media, mainstream left, anywhere. And that I found out almost by accident while I was researching the incoming president, because of his tough, we're going to end the occupation rhetoric. But the incoming prime minister of Syria as of the beginning of 2025 was the president of the International Criminal Court from 2024 to 2025.
Wait, you mean Lebanon, not Syria?
Yes, Lebanon. My apologies.
Yeah. But what I was going to say is, I think the only reason he is saying something like that is because he does have to appeal to the Lebanese people who are overwhelmingly pro-Palestine, or overwhelmingly anti-Zionist for all good reasons and so forth. So he has to make those appeals because the Trump administration has said that they do not want Hezbollah to be part of any coalition government, which is next to impossible because
the Lebanon
is a political force in
Lebanon. The Lebanese constitution has specific requirements for political pluralism that would make it impossible to expel Hezbollah from the government if the recognized constituencies that support Hezbollah elect them. That's just the way it works.
Yeah. But funny enough,
when Israel or the West says things like that, they're basically demanding that Lebanon change its constitution to accommodate the West.
Exactly. Which hopefully doesn't happen. Well, if it were to happen, there would be, I guarantee you, there would be mass demonstrations and a huge political unrest in Lebanon. Because even though a lot of Lebanese people would like to do away with their colonial constitution, their red line is: don't you dare make us even more of a front for Western imperialism than we already are. You touch Hezbollah, you basically touch all of us, more or less.
Despite whatever cultural problems one wants to call out within fundamentalist Islam, the fact remains that Lebanon as a whole is the most queer tolerant country in the Middle East, and that doesn't get said very much.
Interesting.
When they show the lesbian weddings in Beirut are always so cute when they post them on the internet. You don't see them as much as you used to because of the war and everything.
Interesting. Lebanon, that's definitely one of my, hopefully, if things stay somewhat stable, would love to visit Lebanon. But what I was going to say, because you said that very interesting historical fact about the Ottoman Empire before its waning days when it became the segment of Europe, but that mentality of an expansionist Islamic ideology, which does accommodate those who are not believers of Sunniism or Shiaism, Hezbollah definitely has that. And in fact, Hezbollah, if you do elementary research about them, it's very clear. I would describe them as kind of a Shia nationalist thing, because they do say, we respect women's rights, we respect all Lebanese people, we just want all imperial actors, and that includes Zionism, to stay the hell out of Lebanese affairs.
And the people who don't have the only minority group that doesn't have any representation at all in the Lebanese government are Orthodox Christians.
That's interesting.
Orthodox Christians, the group that has traditionally protected Orthodox Christians in Lebanon, is Hezbollah.
Interesting.
Now this goes all the way. Now this may sound weird to people, but this tradition of Muslim groups being the defenders of the rights of specific Orthodox Christian groups goes all the way back to when the Arabs were fighting the Byzantine Empire. And one of the reasons that Syria and Egypt were detached from the Byzantine Empire and became Muslim was because the Syrian and Egyptian Orthodox churches, what we would now call the Coptic Church in Egypt, decided that they would much rather live under Muslim rule than Greek Catholic Orthodox rule.
Because that was something from the West invading
because
their.
the Muslims were not going to interfere with their internal religion, whereas to the Greeks, they were heretics.
Interesting.
So you have to understand. So you have to understand the heresy happiness in Christianity during the long fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, which hung on in some form even after the fall of Constantinople for a couple of generations, in a place called Trebizond. So all of this was going on. The Ottomans, the reason the Ottomans made Constantinople their capital after they took it is because they were claiming the continuity of the Roman Empire. Nobody called the Byzantine Empire in its own day. That's a historical appellation, in the same way that the Ottoman Empire is a historical appellation. Both the Ottoman Empire and the Byzantine Empire called themselves the Roman Empire.
And in fact, one of the reasons, there's many reasons, but one of the reasons why the Roman Catholic Church Empire from Rome lost the Crusades against the Muslims was because they were too busy killing their fellow Christians who were not, who weren't Catholic, who were the Orthodox Church based.
They were also massacring Jews when they could have been fighting their actual enemies. I mean, the reason.
History lesson, Bill Maher. That's why so many Christians lived under the Ottoman Empire.
The reason that Haifa became Haifa is that that Jewish Jaffa was destroyed by the Crusaders during the First Crusade, and the Jewish population massacred, not by the evil Muslim invaders from the East, but by the evil Crusaders from the West. And a lot of Palestinian Jews were expelled from Palestine by the Crusaders and ended up in Europe or the Middle East. They were not expelled by the Muslims. They were expelled by the Christians.
And nowadays, those sort of Jews, at least in Israel, would be called Sephardi Jews, right?
Well, so Mizrahi is the term used in Israel. The groups that originated
somebody of that background.
The Jewish groups that originated from Palestine and were thrown out by Christians during the Crusade went to Syria and Egypt, which were the two closest places with strong Muslim states. And ironically, their descendants were then blamed for Israeli terrorism against Egypt and expelled to Israel as part of a corrupt bargain between the Israeli and Egyptian governments in which they were not consulted.
Zionism completely set back even the whole identity. I mean, even though there's lots of positive things when it comes to like Pan-Arabism, I prefer Pan-Middle Easternism, but that's just me. But Zionism completely set all of that stuff back. And I remember watching one of my favorite things to get me a little bit hopeful when it comes to watching the genocide in Palestine there was this one elderly rabbi who was saying in his speech, anti-Zionist rabbi, and he was saying that, like, in historic Palestine, like, we used to babysit each other's children. We lived in peace. Jews, Muslims, and Christians.
Fun fact. over the history of the development of the Palestinian and Syrian Jewish communities' acceptance of, participation in, and rejection of Zionism, the leader of the Palestinian community was a man who really wanted to see a unified Arab Syria in which Jewish Arabs and Christian Arabs and Muslim Arabs were all together in a unified Arab Syria under the protection of a Muslim king, because traditionally a Muslim king had protected everybody else's rights too.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So that was the point of the original Greater Syria movement. They wanted to see a cosmopolitan Syria on a secular nationalist footing with freedom and representation for all religions, ruled by the Muslim king who had traditionally been the defender of all those other religions from the Christians.
And they actually had a version of that under the Assads, now completely gone. With
they had a version of that. Was the whole point of the Great Arab Revolt and the Hashemite Kingdom of Greater Syria, the culmination of this Syrian Arab national movement that started in Damascus and Jerusalem. And it failed because the British, who made the deals with the Hashemites to create the kingdom, sold them out to the French in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The French invaded Syria and set up Syria and Lebanon as they exist today, while Britain set up the Mandate of Palestine that set the stage for Israel as it exists today.
And although I would never, ever compliment French imperialism, but if you look at who Britain propped up after World War II, Gulf monarchs.
Well, the French destroyed the monarchy and set up this divide and rule system that set the stage for Baathism in Syria, while setting the stage for the vibrant multicultural democracy with all its strengths and weaknesses that arose in Lebanon.
Yeah.
At the same time, it had a hard time creating cross-faith, secular liberal institutions because everything was divvied out by religion and or ethnicity under the French system, and everybody had their portion of French Syria.
But doesn't that goes to show you that Western imperialists, even with all of their nonsense talk about we're the cradle to the grave, we know how to unite people, what they actually do export is the kind of issues the United States, Canada, Australia, and France itself still is dealing with, which is why can't, which goes back to what Rodney King famously said, why can't we all just get along?
And you can find fault if you want with Rodney King's personal character, but I mean, he was right. Why can't we all just get along? This is one of the basic questions that we keep asking over and over again. Why can't we all just get along? It's circle back to Chris Hayes on Bill Maher's show for all one's criticisms of Chris Hayes. Why can't we mind our fucking business?
Although, funny thing is, because I was, throwing a lot of shade at the British because British imperialism is quite literally the root of so much evil. But that being said, if you're a Muslim and if you're a Muslim woman, it's much better to be living in Britain where nobody is going to harass you except for the occasional, acts of Islamophobic hate crimes, whereas in France, France's liberal bigotry is France's own worst enemies.
France's legal crackdown on various female Muslim self-identification under Macron is really exactly the sort of thing Macron was allegedly elected to stop the Nazis from doing.
Exactly.
As is busting the heads of labor activists because they protest a gasoline tax. And when you really think about that, what was the point of Macron if first he was going to discriminate against Muslims and bust the heads of the working class in exactly the way the Nazis would have, and second, compromise with the Republican Party in order to make a deal with the Nazis to keep the anti-fascist left from taking any power in the government?
This kind of goes back to the whole theme of our conversation, because it actually, like, I was just thinking about this right now when it comes to France. Sarkozy was quite the dog whistler and got in power on a huge, I'm going to be tough on law and order when there was a huge police brutality sort of thing.
Sarkozy was also a very, very wealthy businessman, was he not?
I believe
where his brother was?
Yeah. And
the reason I say that is because Sarkozy was very much a precursor to Trump in many ways, and we ignore that and don't talk about it.
Well, and we also, but what also gets missed out is that every time the Le Pens are like this close to taking in power, it's you have to support Macron or a Chirac or a Francois Hollande because Marine Le Pen is the biggest Nazi scumbag who's going to inflict all sorts of stuff. And yet Francois Hollande, when he was in power, evicted Roma people, clamped down hard on anti-Zionist movements and so forth.
I got to go back to this again, though. Sarkozy was a rich businessman married to a supermodel.
Yeah, he was.
This is Trump.
I'm completely missing. What was Carla Bruni?
Yes, Carla Bruni.
But still less obnoxious than still less obnoxious than Donald Trump.
Also, let's also point out the irony of a Frenchman named Sarkozy being anti-immigrant. Because
exactly.
Why are Frenchmen named Sarkozy French?
Hungarian, I believe. Hungarian.
No. Very close, though.
Hungarian Jews, or
Sarkozy is that right part of Europe, a little further north, some traditional history of interaction with France. One French king was even king of this country for 2 years.
Oh, wait. Okay, you say tip, right? Tip, not down. So I'm not thinking about Corsica.
Northern Europe, not southern.
I'm completely blanking. I'll just say it.
Poland. The reason that there are French people named Sarkozy is because of the history of Polish Republicans fleeing Austrians and Germans and Russians to go to France after some sort of horrible imperial bloodbath.
Okay, interesting.
It started with Napoleon, who brought a whole bunch of Polish people to France and settled them all over the French Empire and had a Polish guard and made his brother Grand Duke of Warsaw.
Oh, fascinating. I did not know that.
Napoleon did not support actual Polish independence, but he did everything he could just short of it to support Polish nationalism.
Napoleon was certainly, some describe him as kind of a proto-Leninist in his own right. to a degree, I guess that's sort of true. But yeah, he would support Republican movements because they were anti-monarch, but then it was always
Yes.
under the,
Well, I
you
mean,
know,
he ended up betraying republicanism to make himself an emperor.
exactly.
And there's a book called The Scrambler Unleashed: Napoleon's Campaigns in Italy. And it's about the beginning of Napoleon's career. And it talks about his later stuff too, but it really focuses a lot on the early stuff in Italy.
Oh,
But
2 minutes on that book. I actually would be
but but
very interested to read that.
but the period there's a chapter about the transition from the republic and the consulate to the monarchy. And during this transition to the monarchy and this series of compromises to try to make himself acceptable to the European order, there's the chapter about his sort of rapprochement with Austria, and they call it, and the name of the chapter is The Fattening. And the premise of the chapter is this is the moment where Napoleon lost his political legitimacy everywhere but with the people who were his hardcore supporters no matter what.
In fact,
Because he threw Josephine over, who, despite everything, Josephine was tremendously popular with the French people. Her husband was actually Napoleon's adopted son and heir at the time that he divorced her to marry the Austrian emperor's daughter.
So was Josephine sort of like a kind of like an Eva Peron type of person?
Josephine was very much an Eva Peron type of figure. Josephine was the sort of person who would have been a royal mistress under the appropriate king, because when she met Napoleon, she was married to someone else and became his mistress.
Interesting.
And he used his position in politics to amicably negotiate her divorce from her husband, who remained one of his close political supporters. And her son, by her ex-husband, became his adopted son and original intended heir and king of Italy.
Interesting.
So when he divorced Josephine, it was a huge political deal that really was, and he married an Austrian princess like Marie Antoinette. So he divorced this sort of French revolutionary bourgeois hero figure who had become the bourgeois empress of France alongside the bourgeois emperor under this Bonapartist Republican myth. And he married an Austrian princess like the one whose head they cut off.
Unbelievable. And actually,
just think what that did to his legitimacy with so many people in France, though.
That's quite interesting. And there still are in France. France is quite a fascinating country in many ways, because there still are like the super rich. A lot of them come from very, very old money. And when you trace them down, they were basically just like aristocratic elites.
They were the nobility when France still had a nobility, and they just don't use their duke and count anymore.
Exactly. Not like so.
The ones who wanted to use their duke and count. The ones who wanted to use their duke and count moved to places like Monaco and Spain and Luxembourg and Liechtenstein and Belgium.
And Belgium too, and that's why, like, in France, you'll never. It's not like in England where you still have, like, Lord Harrisburg over here, or Lady Byron over here, or Baroness Thatcher and stuff like that. England did very well in, like, conserving
after
their reactionary aristocrats.
The Third Republic, whatever else you want to say for them, they really, really made it politically unpopular to use those noble titles.
But the funny thing and the very fascinating thing about modern France is, if you go to if you go to France and you go to, like, a newsstand where they have, like, all the different French newspapers and French magazines, one of their best-selling magazines is one which is devoted to look at the Prince of Norway, look at the King and Queen of England, and look at what the Dutch King and Queen are doing and so forth. And in Belgium, you have that a lot. And
look how much
because, my mom, for that reason, is a monarchs and noblemen and stuff like that, and actually collects these magazines.
Look how much Americans love the English royals. You realize,
and all of that, and all of that is colonial hangovers, which is still there. Which is why in Canada you still have people, shocking as it is, when you ask them, "Is it time for Canada to abolish the monarch?" and many of them still go, "No, it's tradition, it's culture."
It's tradition. It's culture. We believe, even though we believe in democracy now and have a constitution, we just have to keep making these old white people disgustingly rich at the expense of the people.
Exactly, and it's also why in Canada, it's also why in Canada, also in Australia, New Zealand, you also have an unelected Senate.
The one
just
thing,
like England still has its House of Lords. So yeah.
The one thing I will say for I think it's the Danish royals, they all have real jobs, except for the king himself, whose job is unfortunately pretty much being king. But everybody else in the royal family has a real job and spends their time doing their real job.
But in fact, I have a book called "And What Do You Do?" which what the royal family doesn't want you to know. Excellent book about the British British monarch, written by a former Liberal Democrat MP, Norman Baker. That's a must-get book, and that really makes the case why England, long overdue to abolish their monarchy.
Japanese
really are parasites.
The Japanese monarchy is going to just abolish itself for the simple fact
that
their sons keep marrying commoners and giving up their succession rights. There's not going to be anybody to be emperor at some point.
Oh no, but I thought that the other problem was that they often keep producing women, and because of like the sexism.
Well, no, so that's the thing is they changed the law. Actually, they changed the law so that the crown princess will become empress when Akihito dies. You know that, right?
No. I completely
They changed the law so that the crown princess will inherit specifically because of this succession problem. But the problem is that at some point there's not going to be any heir because people keep marrying commoners, and there aren't a lot of Japanese aristocrats left. Most of the Japanese aristocrats, other than the imperial family, have become bourgeois and completely married into the capitalist families. So it's really kind of ironic in that the Japanese society has become so bourgeois that the monarchy is just abolishing itself over time by intermingling with the commoners.
And that's funny in and of itself. The irony is so striking, given that Japan. What was it that Nobel Prize for Literature, the Peruvian Mario Vargas, once said about Mexico, that it was the perfect dictatorship? That's Japan in a nutshell, because since World War II, the only party that's continuously governed is the right-wing Liberal Democrats.
There was that one guy, Kazumi, was prime minister for 3 years in the 90s. And was totally sabotaged by the entire Western establishment, and the Liberal Democrats went right back into power.
And then it happened, and it happened again sometime in the early 2000s.
Yes,
sometime in the early 2000s.
It was Kazumi again, I think.
The Democrat Party finally was given its marching papers, and a new quasi-liberal reformist government came, and fuck, man, Western imperialism, the U.S. elites and so forth, did everything they can to sabotage him. I think he was out of power by the end of the year.
I think it was even Koizumi again, the same guy. And once again, it was like barely, a year to 2 to 3 years tops. Then then there was the guy who was the independent, but despite being an independent, was still basically tied into all the same liberal Democrat people.
Yeah. Awful party.
I can't remember his name. Was that Abe? No, Abe was still a liberal Democrat.
Shinzo Abe, who's
Abe was still a liberal Democrat.
Yeah, the party's called the Liberal Democrat Party, but very, very right,
Yes, yes.
Very...
No, I'm just thinking out loud. There was a guy before Abe who claimed to be an independent, but who was really just another liberal Democrat. I can't remember what his name was, though.
Toshiro Mifune, I think. No. That's the Japanese.
That's an actor, yeah. The best actor, one of the greatest actors of all time. But I don't know that we would have liked his politics, been that he was a reconnaissance photographer in the Japanese Air Force during World War II, which means he might have done reconnaissance for Pearl Harbor. Who knows?
Interesting. But the guy I'm thinking about, let me see.
Fun fact: he wanted to apply for a job as a photographer with Toho Studios, taking pictures of people for press releases. But they weren't hiring photographers. So a friend of his took a couple of headshots of him and put him in an open casting call saying, hey, if you don't like acting, you can get a job as a photographer when one opens up. And he ends up becoming the biggest movie star in Japanese history.
Were you thinking of this guy, Jonshiro Koizumi?
That's
who supports the Iraq War.
That's the guy.
Yeah. Handsome devil as well. Just look at that nice set of hair he has, man.
Yeah, he was a pro-Western blah, despite being not a liberal Democrat.
Yeah, and this piece of shit. His father and grandfather were the Japanese fascist Shinzo Abe.
Yep.
And he got his dead zone. He got his dead zone that came to him. So
Sic semper tyrannis.
Alrighty, well, I unfortunately have to go because
it's been a long show, and I actually was thinking about so final thoughts, anything to promote?
Check out 1+1 and subscribe, donate generously, and help us overcome those far right algorithms, and do the same for Chris. And just parting gifts is that let's not be deer in the headlights. Let's not fall to Trump derangement syndrome. Closing something like USAID is a good thing, but that being said, let's all mobilize against Trump's very reactionary agenda. And it is very good to hear that people are doing it. They're just not getting the attention from the media, but mostly left-wing.
My final thought is a sort of cross between USAID and Elon Musk, because it goes together. The fact that USAID, which, by the way, USAID employees are suing the federal government, and a federal judge has an injunction against shutting down USAID, so nothing's actually happening yet. But USAID isn't going to be defunded even if they defund it. It's just a matter of putting it back directly in the hands of somebody like the military or the CIA or the State Department, where the president can exercise more direct control of it, and where it can be more hostile and behind the scenes and subversive again. So they want to make it worse, not better. That's the thing about the far right. They want to make USAID worse, not better.
You hear that, libertarians?
So when they denounce
Trump as a peacenik,
when they denounce USAID, they just want the military or CIA or State Department or some combination of the three to do it all instead.
And people just have to mobilize against it. And I think, I think going forward, I think I even made a tweet about this. While it's good that we have left-leaning folks and we have people who are critical readers, we got to do much more to decolonize the mind of people and let people know that the CIA isn't just the military that just marches and lights a country like Vietnam or Iraq on fire. They also do it through these fake semi-NGOs who are also the enemy, and we have to mobilize against them as well. So.
Please like this show on YouTube. Please subscribe on YouTube. Youri has 720 subscribers. I've got 639. I would love to have as many as Youri.
Okay.
so there's a goal if you can do it. Like, subscribe, and share the video if somewhere else so that someone else can like and subscribe if you really like this. That's number one. I hate to sound like I'm giving orders, but if someone really considered themselves a loyal soldier for the show, then that's something that I would really appreciate. Is like, subscribe, and share it somewhere so someone else can like or subscribe.
And if you can, and of course, if you can, donate generously and do donate.
If you can donate generously. If you can't, share the links asking for donations along with all the other stuff. Follow me on Twitter, share the content on Twitter, help me break through the algorithms on Twitter and Substack and the lack of algorithms on Blue Sky. I would really, really love that help. That's the thing that would really help me even more than becoming a patron. But yes, if you can afford to support independent media financially, please support me, support Youri, support Julia Doubleday at the Gauntlet, support independent media doing independent work without corporate support.
Exactly.
On that note, thank you very much, Youri. Thank you very much, audience. Everybody have a great week, and we will tweet at you.